The five laws of over communication, how the world's most effective leaders actually get things done. Most leaders don't fail from lack of intelligence. They fail from under communication. Today, I'll reveal the five laws of over communication used by elite leaders to cut through the noise, create certainty, and drive execution. You're going to learn three things. Number one, how to command attention instantly through conviction, clarity, and simplicity. Number two, eliminate confusion and misalignment so people act faster and with confidence. And number three, raise standards and accountability without drama, fear, or burnout. So you're going to stop being misunderstood, and today you're going to start being followed. Let's go over each of the five laws right now. And I want you to understand that most business leaders and personal relationships dramatically under communicate. And this is the silent killer of leadership, effectiveness, and respect. Now, these laws apply to all types of leadership, from parenting to leading companies as a CEO. These laws can also apply to your personal relationships. And for each one of them, I want you to rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10 on how well you think you are practicing the law. And at the end, you're going to choose one that you really want to work on right now, starting today. So law number one is the law of 90-10. Listen 90% of the time, talk 10% of the time. The greatest leaders, the most respected leaders, listen more than they talk. They know what they know. They want to know what you know. So here's a quote by Dr. Stephen R. Covey, wrote the book 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, that really tells the whole story of this law, the law of 90-10. If I were to summarize in one sentence the single most important principle I have learned in the field of interpersonal relationships, it would be this: seek first to understand, then to be understood. Law number two, the law of simplicity. Simple is remembered and acted upon. Complex isn't. So here's a quote from Perry Marshall. You should always be suspicious of complicated things. You should be even more suspicious of people who make things complicated. To me, that's the sign of a charlatan. If they make things that are simple complex. That's also the tell of a non-expert. They're making something that can be simplified into something complex. Here's a quote from Paul Akers. Simplification attracts, complication repels. If you complicate something, you are going to push people away. If you simplify it, you are going to magnetize everybody to you. Here's a quote from the great coach John Wooden. He was ESPN's coach of the century. Don't be a coaching genius. Don't give your players too much information. Always practice simplicity with constant repetition. Here's a quote from John Spence, wrote one of my all-time favorite leadership and business books, Awesomely Simple. John says, some people believe that making things complex somehow makes them look more intelligent. It's quite the opposite. As Einstein said, if you cannot explain it to a 6-year-old, you don't understand it yourself. Here's some quotes from the great Dr. Price Pritchett, one of the world's leading, maybe the world leader in merger integration expertise. Dr. Pritchett has worked with, at one time, 400 out of the Fortune 500 companies. And he asked the question, how simple can we make this? He also says, in a world of complexity, the best weapon is simplicity. Here's a question from my great mentor and teacher, Dr. Alan Weiss, who's written close to 70 books on business now, one of the world's greatest consultants and experts on leadership. He says, how do we get there faster and easier? How do we get there fastest and easiest? And he's a real disciple of Occam's razor, the principle of Occam's razor. And here's how he explains it. The quickest solution, the easiest solution is probably going to be most effective. Occam said that the easiest way is always the best way. Now, here's an excerpt from the Founders podcast by the great David Senra. And David is talking about Lee Clow, who is an advertising genius and also a great mentor to Steve Jobs, the co founder of Apple. And here's what Lee had to say, or here's how David explains it, how Lee taught Steve Jobs simplicity. Your goal is a single idea expressed clearly. And for advertising, you should really try to pick just one message per ad. And so this is another example where they're going over this idea for ads for a new Apple product. And Steve Jobs said there's 5 things they really need to do well. We should mention all 5 things in the ad, Steve said. And the founder of the advertising agency, Lee Clow, and a close friend of Steve Jobs for Steve decades, told Steve and did this demonstration of the difference between a good ad and a bad ad. Lee crumpled up a piece of paper into a ball and threw it to Steve and asked him to catch it. And Steve was able to. Lee said, "That is a good ad." Then he crumpled up 5 pieces of paper into little balls and threw them all towards Steve at the same time and asked him to catch them. And Steve didn't catch any of them. And Lee said, "That is a bad ad." And Lee's point was that the more things that you ask people to focus on, the less they remember. Law number 3, the law of certainty. Here's a quote from the law of conviction. And this is about speaking with certainty. Okay? This is about speaking with and acting with conviction because it's very persuasive to people who follow you. Now, you have to earn this conviction. You have to earn this certainty, which I'll get to in the end here of this law. But here's a quote from Brian Billick. He was the Super Bowl champion head coach of the Baltimore Ravens football team. And Brian said, if you don't think you're the guy, you're not. And if you are going to hold one of these jobs, you better think you're one of the guys. John Adams says, you've mistaken my passion and ego for conviction. You've mistaken my passion for ego and my conviction for arrogance. Here's a quote from Dan Kennedy, one of my favorite authors on business and leadership. He says, people actually prefer to be associated with someone who is absolutely certain of themselves and their conviction. And here's another quote from David Senra. And he talks about David Ogilvy, the genius advertising executive. David Ogilvy said, the good ones know more. A lot of his books tell you that you need to do your professional research. You need to make sure you are knowledgeable in your field, more knowledgeable in your field than anyone else. Read and learn as much as you can. The best basketball players know the most about basketball. The best advertisers know the most about advertising. The good ones know more. And this is so important, this law of conviction. And here's the definition of the law. Conviction commands attention. Conviction cuts through the noise. Where certainty exists, attention follows. Hesitation is ignored. Conviction is followed. That's how we must think about this law. Now, here's another quote from David Senra from the Great Founders podcast. And he talks about David Ogilvy again. He said, a zealous student of business, David Ogilvy claimed he had read every book about advertising. He disdained others who felt that they did not need this knowledge. He doesn't mince words about this. He says, if you are failing to study the history of your profession, if you are not reading as much as possible, he calls you an ignorant amateur. Now that is strong, an ignorant amateur. You will not forget that term. So what does this have to do with the law of certainty? Well, the law of conviction. You have to, in order to speak with conviction, you have to know more. You've got to be an expert at what you're talking about. You have to do your research. You have to learn from the greatest experts. You've got to study the science and the case studies. So that's how we are able to speak with conviction and practice the law of conviction. So let's talk about Law number 4 now, the law of repetition. And the law of repetition tells us that when you are sick of saying something, that's when it starts to sink in to your people who are listening. And when your people get sick of hearing something from you, that's when it starts to sink in for them. This is so important. Again, most leaders under communicate. They don't say things enough. They under communicate the simplicity of something and make it too complex. So let's talk about the law of repetition now. John Stevens tells us that the rule of 7 is a marketing principle that states that your prospects need to come across your offer at least 7 times before they really notice it and start to take action. Now, this was a study on an old study from the movie industry that they had to run an ad 7 times for people to start to remember it. It was a study long ago, and I think it's a very important study. And here's a quote from the book, The CEO Next Door, great book for CEOs. And the authors, Elena Botello and Kim Powell, tell us any message has to be repeated 7 times in 7 different ways before an organization has any hope of hearing it. Formal memo, videotape, a blog, posting a printed memo on the bulletin board, a town hall meeting, parking lot talk, as you're walking, chat around the water cooler. You've got to push. You can't over communicate. And that's a great example of the law of repetition. You've got to say it in all kinds of different ways over and over and over again before it starts to sink in. Okay, last law, the law number 5, the law of the standard. Tell the truth today. Never walk by greatness or mediocrity without saying something. Always let people know where they stand, for good and for bad. So most leaders just catch people doing things wrong, or they don't say anything at all. They just neglect. Okay, most leaders fall into that category. They're either just catching people doing things wrong, or they just neglect to say anything about anything. Okay, you must do a lot more of catching people doing things right, first and foremost, as well as challenging people to be better, to be, again, that ultra leader, that top 0.001%. You've got to be catching people doing things right a lot, and then occasionally challenging them to be better. So here's a quote from Keith Cunningham, great business expert. He says the reason we hesitate to have the hard conversations is because we don't care enough. If you truly cared enough, you would say what needs to be said. After all, how else are you going to improve and maximize their potential? Let me remind you that nothing can change until the unspoken is said. Here's a quote from Tim Ferriss, great podcaster, great best-selling author on elite performance. And he says a person's success in life can be visually measured by the number of uncomfortable conversations he or she is willing to have. Here's a quote from the late, great Bill Walsh, 3-time Super Bowl champion head coach of the San Francisco 49ers. He said, reinforce the positives and the rest takes care of itself. So it's not just about challenging people to be better. It's about reinforcing the positives. Catch people doing things right. Let them know what they're doing right, and they'll do more of it, whether you from a leadership position or just in your personal relationships. Be appreciative of the great things that people are doing for you and in relationships, and let them know. So lastly, here's one more quote from David Senra, a story from his Founders podcast. And he talks about how blunt communication is effective and direct communication is extremely simple. So here's a story about Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs believed that blunt communication was effective. Direct communication was extremely simple. So in every single book that I've read about Steve Jobs, the people who that worked with him all day say the exact same thing. He was very easy to understand. If he thought something was great, he's going to tell you. If he thought your work was terrible, he's going to tell you. Being blunt, being direct is the most simple form of communication. I think one of the most important byproducts of this is that with clear communication, with the blunt communication that Steve Jobs used, everybody understood the standards that he insisted and they upheld them. So there's the 5 laws of over communication. I want you to rate yourself. Again, you rated yourself on a scale of 1 to 10 for each one of the laws. Which one do you need to improve the most today? And I want you to really focus on it. I want you to really focus on um, improving that law because it'll have a dramatic effect on your ability to be effective as a leader and also respected and admired as a leader. But ultimately, it's about getting things done. The byproduct is getting things done and doing the right thing by people. And the byproduct is you become respected, admired, follow. You have a great career as you define it. But very few leaders practice these 5 laws. I mean, it is a criminally low number of leaders who practice these 5 laws. I mean, once you see and hear these, you can't unsee them or unhear them. So now you will look around and you will see that they're rarely practiced. And I'm not judging, I'm just reporting. It's because these things are not taught. We pull from great psychology, we pull from great marketing expertise to really look at what works and what doesn't. So again, I'm going to challenge you, to really practice these 5 laws. The law of 90-10. Listen 90% of the time and talk 10% of the time. Number 2, the law of simplicity. Simple is remembered and acted upon. Complex isn't. Number 3, the law of conviction. Conviction commands attention. Conviction cuts through the noise. Where certainty exists, conviction exists, attention follows. Hesitation is ignored. Conviction is followed. In law number 4, the law of repetition, when you get sick of saying something, that's when it starts to sink in. When they get sick of hearing something, that's when it starts to sink in. And lastly, the law of the standard, tell the truth today. Never walk by greatness or mediocrity without saying something. Always let people know where they stand for good and for bad. So again, my challenge to you, pick one of these laws, start attacking them today. If you picked one and really worked hard on them for the next, say, 2 months, really dove in hard and got better, in less than a year with these 5 laws in 10 months, you can really become a top 0.001% an ultra leader. I wish you a life of success, happiness, and positive impact.